So I was thinking about the last video before I start this one, which I generally do. And one thing I didn't cover that I think is good before we start into actually creating a class for our carbon footprint data so far is if I come back here and I look at the class that we've set up, which is human, and we've created two instances of that human, right? We've used the human template, the class, to create an object, in this case two of them. And then we've run functions, but when they're in this configuration of inside of a class or inside of an object, remember we call those methods. Okay? It's just to distinguish them because we've seen methods in this course, like we've seen quite a few, like console.log, right? That's a method. The .log on console. So, but the other thing you can do here, and I didn't mention this, is I could also say, I could take Rio, right? And I could dot HRV equal, and then I could give it a number, like my HRV, my variable heart rate. Okay, and if I did that, then what would happen, and matter of fact, let's just do it to see this in action. If I come over here and I go to my sources, make my page a little bigger, right, and I come down to main, make sure that code's in there, and it is, right? So then, it should be, we'll put it right here so we have it. Right, so as soon as that line executes, I can roll over myself, and I can see that that HRV key value pair has been added into my object of instantiated, but it's not on Jane. Okay, Jane wouldn't have that because in this case I've only added it to the instantiated object, not to the class. And that's actually, that concept is really powerful, and it may seem simple, but it's important to understand this is part of how we can create objects from a template and then give them unique data to themselves. Now I say that because as I move into this next section, I realized, you know what, I didn't actually talk about that. And you could also do the same with adding methods later. You just typically, because you would know them at the beginning, you would set them up in your constructor function. But we're going to see this in action in our code, and I think this is a good time to start thinking about it. But the other thing before, I just want to say this, is typically when you're creating these classes, you're creating them with an entity in mind. An entity is a larger category that would encapsulate humans. So of course, these probably wouldn't be the key value pairs we would think of as common to all humans, although they are, right? But typically, like the more common one you see is called person, person's name, person's, a hair color makes sense, maybe their careers, right? So things more generic to that, but just to tell you, these are generally created with an entity in mind, a larger category that encompasses that concept. But it doesn't always have to be that way. But just generally, that's when we start thinking about creating classes. That's kind of what we consider. Okay, so let's think about now where we could create a class in our code, right, to reflect. In this case, I kind of gave you the hint before, but right, we're creating objects right now. And those objects are made up of key value pairs that we're setting values and calculated values that we are also storing on the object. So this is a prime case for creating a class that would handle this functionality for us. We would still create a module for it. Right? As a matter of fact, we're going to start there. We already have one for carbon footprint, so in a way, this is going to end up replacing the CFP file, and it'll end up replacing this for the start, which I knew I'd always get rid of, but now is the time. Okay, so here's how I would start this, and I would, follow along. So let's create a file, and I'm going to call this one fp.js. Okay, so footprint. And one of the things you're going to hear me talk about as we do this work is simplifying variable names. Naming things is like a joke in programming. Naming things is one of the hard things to do. But and having said that, and if you didn't catch this, and I don't think I mentioned it, when we're setting up classes, when we're coding them syntactically, the best practice is to capitalize them. Now, you don't have to. It would still work if you lowercase that, or camel cased it. But in this case, the reason we uppercase these is that it's a signal to those who are reading your code, oh, that's a class. So and when you call new on it, right? When you see new, and news, you see it like new date, new object. Now in this case, we're creating new objects, so not the best example, but just know that that's not part of the syntax. It's part of the best practice. So I'm going to call this FB for footprint. Okay. Now remember, right? So in this case, this looks different, the syntax. Now, by the way, I always like to, especially if I'm coding something, actually I would put main over here, right? And just to keep in mind. So the first thing I'm going to need is that constructor, okay? Now, in the constructor is where you want to set the key value pairs, okay, for our footprint. So what are those values that we would set in here, right? So if we scroll back up, what are the values? Well, the values come from first name, last name, household members, and house size, right? So these are just values that each footprint need in order to do the rest of the calculation, right? So these are your inputs. Yeah, this is a good review, right? And these are your calculated values that end up being key value pairs, but they are calculated and then stored in the object. So in this case, we would start with the values, the first name, last name, household members, and house size. And so what we would do, right, so we'd pass them in. So first, and I'm just going to call it first, last. And you're going to see me change these names of this to make this more clear because in reading it I realized it wasn't, and I'm going to call it house members. I'm going to call it house size. Okay, so those are for when I set up a new footprint. Those are the key value pairs I need to set that footprint up. So then I could say this dot first. Remember we learned about before this, and now we've learned about it again, and understanding it, the context of the instantiated object in this case, and we use equal here, which is different than what we've seen when we've done objects before. So we're saying the classes, when we create new objects, its key called first is going to be equal to whatever is passed in when we create it. There's no syntax for each to distinguish each line. This is again what we call syntax sugar, just to make our lives easier. Equal to last. This dot house members equal to house members. This dot house size equal to house size. Okay, so now we have those input values that we got from the user, the 4 inputs. So we could already start using our class, okay, even before we do anything else, just to see what it looks like and does it work. So to see that, I would come down in here, right? So right now is where we're going to call start, and we can leave that there for now, okay? But we can also, maybe we could do it after, right? In this case, we'd set up a new object. Now the name of this object is somewhat irrelevant because it doesn't show up later when we actually store it in the array. but it's good because it is telling us what it is. So I'm going to say a new FP object. Okay, or we could just call it new object, but I like giving it what it is. Or we could just call it FP object. Yeah, actually I think I'll call it that. Okay, equals new, and this we call FP. Okay, and what do we need? What are we passing into it? Well, we're passing into it all the same values, right? All the same values. Actually, I think I got the extra. Yeah. Let me make this a little bit smaller, and let me drop this so we can actually have a little more room, right? Right? So we need all the same stuff here. But there's some, okay, so now that's instantiating the new object, and we can look at in the console or in our dev tools what that looks like. But what else do we need to do? Remember, we're creating, in this case, a new class, but this new class is also a new module, right? So we'd export FP, okay? And then we'd come over to here, and then we'd import it, right? FP, okay? Okay, so that's at least setting up the basic of the constructor, right, of what we would need. So now, let's actually see if it runs. Okay, so what I'd do here is I'd scroll up and I would place, let me make sure I have, oh, I was down. Yeah, I have it here, okay? So what I'd do here is I would put a breakpoint, I would refresh the page, and now again, until I have some data, it's not going to do anything. So now my breakpoint on the submit inside the event listener now is going to call new. Okay, so if we step in, we'll see it open that file. We can see what it passed in, right? These are the values it passed in. We see it set. I'm not sure why it didn't say on the first one, but okay, last. Each of those got set correctly, which is awesome, right? Great, so we have now a new object, okay? We have our first object created. Now, again, this looks a little different than what we've seen before, right? It says it still has the key value pairs, right? It still lists all the key value pairs in them, and in this case, we're just dropping them down. But in this case, we do have a prototype, and they call it a constructor. It's the class itself, right? Now, there's a lot of content here. Most of it in 4, right, just means 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Yeah. Okay, so we have that. So that's the first step, is like creating that class, right? And setting it up so it works in our environment. My challenge to you, so first what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you commit this code, okay? And then your code challenge, and you'll submit that later, separately. I'll give you a commit for that, is to attempt, okay, the next stage. Now, the next part of this would be to set up a method that would calculate would calculate household points. So then you have to think about how do I first, we've already seen in our example how to create methods, right? We saw a very simple example, how to create methods. We know the syntax. We know that when we want to reference, right, some value on the instantiated object, how we would do that. Okay. Now in this case, our method only output a, but you are going to actually attempt to write a method that will, in this case, it'd be in here, right? That will actually determine house size points. Now I'm going to end up naming this something different, a more simple name, but that's okay. Name it whatever. Think about what it needs, right? How do you reference that inside the object? And remember what's going to happen here, where we set a value, then you will end up adding a new key value into the object itself. Okay? So think about that. And then there's your logic, right? So here we've set it up and we've returned it. And here's your hint. You don't have to do these two, this line and this line, because you now have an object that you can, inside of your method, add a new value. Now you're not actually adding it up in here in your code. You're calling, that's why I started today with the example of adding things. Now in this case it's not the exact example, but I was showing you the concept of that you can add after you instantiate them. Now you can talk about whether this is exactly the way you should do it, but more than anything I just want to give you some experience about this. So what you want to do here, right, is commit this, right, and then attempt the code challenge, and then commit that says my code challenge.